History as it happens, March 3rd, 2022. Lenin, Stalin, Putin.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Yesterday, reporters asked me if I thought President Putin was smart. I said, of course he's smart, to which I was greeted with, oh, that's such a terrible thing.
You declare the war. It is the responsibility of this body to stop the war.
This isn't called a war. This is called a special military operation in the Donbass.
What is going on in the mind of Vladimir Putin? Russia's leader invaded his neighbor without provocation, then placed his nuclear forces on heightened alert. If he's trying to restore Russia's imperialist past, he's unable to accept that history has moved on. Military historian Antony Beevor says Putin is a very dangerous beast who risks extending his war to the Baltic states and beyond. And he joins us next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We've seen the way that one or two previous dictators in Russia have not been taken seriously. Here, in the case of Putin, what we've seen, which is actually slightly more alarming, is the way that he has changed so much in the last couple of years.
At a news conference on February 11th, 2 weeks before he would order his forces to invade Ukraine, Vladimir Putin once again reminded the world he would not tolerate Ukraine joining NATO. Now, that's a position long shared by the Russian establishment, not just Putin. But he went further. A visibly angry Putin said, "Do you realize that if Ukraine joins NATO and decides to take Crimea back through military means, the European countries will automatically get drawn into a military conflict with Russia?" He went on to say, "Of course NATO's united potential and that of Russia are incomparable. We understand that, but we also understand that Russia is one of the world's leading nuclear powers and is superior to many of those countries in terms of the number of modern nuclear force components. There will be no winners," he said, and you'll find yourself drawn into this conflict against your will. Now, I am no Putin scholar or mind reader or psychologist here, but to listen to the leader of a nuclear power openly discussing using those weapons should Ukraine join NATO and try to retake Crimea, annexed by Russia in 2014, to hear something like that is almost unbelievable. Talking about nuclear weapons. Now, maybe it was a bluff or bluster, but he certainly wasn't bluffing about sending his armored columns toward Kyiv, was he? At an earlier news conference on February 1st, Russia's dictator rambled about how the U.S. was trying to drag Moscow into a war, once again raising a hypothetical Ukrainian invasion of Crimea. Putin said, "I believe the U.S. does not care much about Ukraine's safety. Their main task is to contain Russia's developments." So we have spent a good deal of time on this podcast recently discussing and debating whether NATO enlargement post-Cold War is a legitimate Russian security concern. We have to remember that major American diplomats also warned that expanding NATO to include former Soviet satellites and republics could provoke Russia. Putin's fear of NATO has deep historical roots.
And this notion of encirclement, that the world was against them, has very, very deep roots, and it goes back a very long way. And this is quite clear from Putin's extraordinary history lecture. Some of it is accurate, some of it is completely ludicrous.
My conversation with Sir Antony Beevor is coming up in a moment. Vladimir Putin not only sees himself as a historic figure, he uses history, one might say distorts the past, to rationalize his foreign policy. And now some observers fear this once clever, shrewd operator is becoming unhinged, even paranoid. Historians must always balance larger historical forces and structures against the influence of individuals when explaining why things happen. There are times when certain individuals exercise enormous influence over events, when individuals more so than impersonal forces dictate history. I'm sure some names immediately come to mind, Stalin and Hitler, to name two. And those two villains are relevant to this conversation. Russia and Ukraine share a very complicated past, the details of which are often overlooked or ignored in mainstream discourse about today's war. But that history matters. Putin ransacks that history to claim an independent Ukraine should not even exist. We also have to remember something that adds another layer of complexity to all this. Many people who live in Ukraine are Russian, and in some parts of the country, Russian is the predominant language. To some, those places, namely Crimea, belong to Russia, case closed. So as we read today's headlines, we can see that civilians are being killed, infrastructure is being destroyed, another generation baptized by war. And right now, we can only imagine the long-term consequences for Europe. And remember, since 2014, pro-Russian separatists have been fighting a war in the Donbass, where Putin's formal recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics killed off the Minsk peace process. In those separatist enclaves, Putin accused Ukraine of committing genocide, another departure from reality. So as he tries to dictate the course of Eastern European history, the early returns show Putin badly miscalculated. But as our guest wrote in an op-ed in The Mail, he is an unstable dictator with the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. But who can rein him in? Antony Beevor is one of the world's preeminent military historians and a prolific author. He has a new book coming out in May about an old subject, but the issues it covers are certainly fresh. The title is Russia, Revolution and Civil War, 1917 to 1921. Sir Antony, welcome back.
Thanks very much.
In your op-ed in The Mail, you wrote that we have not taken a dictator seriously. Who is we, and how was Vladimir Putin not taken seriously?
Well, we, I think, are, in general, the Western democracies. What's interesting, of course, is that we've seen the way that one or two previous dictators in Russia have not been taken seriously. Stalin was despised by the Bolshevik intellectuals, and especially Leon Trotsky. But he had his vengeance in the end. And to what degree he became an obsessive killer is, I think, a matter of record. Here, in the case of Putin, what we've seen, which is actually slightly more alarming, is the way that he has changed so much in the last couple of years. Up until the start, really, of COVID, Putin was an opportunist. He was a very clever opportunist in many ways. But I think he did have a sense of the possible, which is a vital thing in any political leader. Now he seems to have completely lost it in his views on charging into Ukraine. And because things are going so badly in these first days, he may even go further. I mean, there are many commentators who believe he'll actually have a crack at the Baltic states, which would be an act of phenomenal stupidity, because that will bring in Finland and Sweden as well as the Baltic states and NATO. But he seems to have lost all judgment. Where he also probably is reacting is that, yes, we did ignore him for quite a long time. We never took him seriously. And of course, in the West, we find it simply preposterous, those posed photographs of Putin doing macho things, whether it's sort of fishing stripped to the waist, on horseback in the Siberian wilderness. All of this stuff was a sort of pretty pathetic attempt to boost his narcissistic complex.
Macho man.
Macho man indeed.
Well, my next question to you is going to be, did you expect war? I naively believe that all those Russian troops deployed on Ukraine's border, 150,000 of them, weren't going to be sent in to invade a country in 2022. Did you expect war? Do you believe Putin has really lost his bearings?
Well, I have to admit, like you, I couldn't believe that he would do it. It was only when we got the reports of the field hospitals and the blood bank supplies ready for transfusions coming forward that one knew that this actually was for real. It wasn't posturing. It wasn't trying to negotiate with NATO from a position of threat. This guy was really uncontrollable, because the trouble is, within his entourage in the Kremlin, there isn't really anybody who can rein him back in.
Bunch of yes men and sycophants, I think is how you put it.
I mean, frankly, when you've got a dictator who is suffering from this completely narcissistic complex, you can't keep contradicting him. Or if you do, you're out straight away and you will simply have no influence whatsoever. So some of them may try and change or modify some of his positions, but it doesn't go any further than that.
We're going to get into the folly of war in a moment, but about Putin and his mindset, as you know, as a scholar of 20th century wars, it is not uncommon for each side in a conflict to misread their opponent or believe that their opponent is acting irrationally while you yourself are acting in your own best interest and you're acting in defense while your opponent is the one who's acting offensively or aggressively. Do you see that dynamic here at all, or is this really an act of irrationality?
Well, we've seen a lot of confirmation bias, just as we saw a lot of confirmation bias on both sides in the Second World War, and even amongst the British and the Americans, who were convinced in the autumn of 1944 that they really were going to win the war by the end of the year, by Christmas. Here, I mean, Putin has actually even gone beyond that in his conviction that Ukraine would collapse as soon as his troops arrived. And he has believed all of his own lies. And that is always the most frightening aspect, because that's when somebody starts to live in fantasy land.
In my most recent episode, I spoke to the historian Jeffrey Engel about the burden of history and the importance or relevance of the past 30 years post-Cold War promises that were not made about NATO expanding or not expanding, going all the way back to Gorbachev and then Yeltsin, George H.W. Bush, and then Bill Clinton. But in your piece in the Mail, you go back further than that. You say that Putin has fallen into a trap, the same kinds of traps that ensnared Russian leaders about expansion, their right to expand, to act aggressively in their own sphere of influence. Can you discuss that a little?
Well, yes. I mean, you can go all the way back to the 12th century, 11th century, and you have Kievan Rus, this idea of this sort of Slav homeland, which in those days did include Ukraine, Russia, and Belarusia. And there, they found themselves attacked, in this case from the east, above all the Golden Horde. And this notion of encirclement, that the world was against them, has very, very deep roots, and it goes back a very long way. And this is quite clear from Putin's extraordinary history lecture. Some of it is accurate, some of it is completely ludicrous, of drawing completely wrong conclusions and contradicting himself. But it's bizarre. You know, here we find somebody who had so lamented the fall of the Soviet Union, saying it was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. And yet he's blaming Lenin for having allowed the whole principle that the different national republics should have equal say. And therefore, this was what he says, what allowed Ukraine to escape in December 1991. So we're just over 30 years from that particular moment of the actual collapse of the Soviet Union. And as he says, the trouble was they no longer had the Communist Party to hold the whole thing together, because the Communist Party had collapsed from the inside. And this notion that sort of somehow he can restore this central core, but not just the central core. I mean, what's interesting is the way that he was sending troops into Kazakhstan only a few weeks ago. He's already got Lukashenko of Belarus right under his thumb, because his own regime was collapsing until more security troops came in from Russia. And Putin, from that point of view, really thought that he'd only got to bring in and force Ukraine into a subject role. He is determined to get rid of the Ukrainian leadership, which, let's face it, is probably one reason why President Zelensky, who's also behaved so bravely, is quite determined not to concede too much, because, let's face it, he would be one of the first to go, whatever happened. But he is following the pattern of Stalin in the summer of 1945, i.e., when the Red Army swept across the whole of Central Europe. They then turned the countries they occupied then into satellite states. And basically, he's not going to incorporate Ukraine into Russia, but he's certainly going to make Ukraine a satellite state.
You say that Putin is living in a crazed fantasy world of the imperial past when he declares a hostile anti-Russia is being created in our historic lands, referring to Ukraine. And I'm reading from your piece in the Mail. But you also say the United States, NATO, and Europe, or the EU, acted rashly by trying to promote democracy everywhere, namely the eastward expansion and enlargement of NATO. There's a ferocious debate happening in the United States and elsewhere right now. To what extent can NATO enlargement be blamed on what's happening in Ukraine today? In other words, was NATO's enlargement a legitimate national security concern of Russians, not just Putin, but the Russian establishment for the past 30 years? Or is it simply being used as a pretext to dominate Ukraine, a nation that Putin has never respected? Its sovereignty he has never respected.
He's certainly using it, that's true, but he also believes it at the same time. And for him, the key moment was after the Bucharest conference, when NATO came out with this very arrogant statement, basically saying that they were going to allow Georgia or encourage Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO at that stage, without having mentioned anything to the Russians. Well, that was bound to make the Russians furious, not just Putin, but I think all Russians, because it showed how little we paid at that time to the feelings of Russia itself. Now, obviously, in an ideal world, any country which wants democracy should, of course, be allowed to have it. But we've also got to remember that we're still living with the remnants of that realpolitik, the idea that you had spheres of influence and nobody should enter them. And, the United States, as you know, had its own sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine all the way through to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Russians felt that it was completely hypocritical of the West to ignore their concerns about their sphere of influence and what they called the near abroad.
Well, after the Cold War and those heady days after the Cold War, when President Bush told his Secretary of State, James Baker, it was wrong for you to suggest that NATO would not expand to the east. To heck with that, basically, President Bush said. We won, they lost. And I think that attitude has pervaded the past 30 years, that we don't have to regard Russia's ideas or attitudes the same way that we would hope they would regard ours, meaning the United States and NATO.
Well, I remember, to give you an idea, I remember when we were researching in the Russian Ministry of Defense archives back in those days, two of the old women there who were sort of cleaners or whatever were saying how wonderful it was that Raisa Gorbachev had got cancer, because that was vengeance for what Gorbachev himself had done by allowing the collapse of the Soviet Union in the face of NATO.
Putin is not a fan of Gorbachev. Russians in general are not a fan of Gorbachev for dismantling their empire. It's not uncommon for conflict to ensue after an empire collapses. In this case, it would be the Soviet Empire, the former republics like Ukraine, the Baltic states. Baltic states wanted to join NATO after getting out from under Moscow's yoke, as well as the eastern satellite countries. So maybe it took 30 years, which is not a long time when you're talking about the scope of history, right?
Well, indeed. Finland had been warned by Russia. In that particular case, it was the Grand Duchy of Finland and was in the unique ownership of the Tsar, not of the Russian government. But Finland was warned right from the start, even after they won the Civil War in 1918, and by that I mean the Whites against the Red Finns. They were warned that, you must never take up arms against us. But it was when Russia itself and Stalin launched his attack on Finland in the Winter War that one saw quite how well the Finns can fight, and they will fight. The Finns actually have about the largest, you wouldn't believe this, but actually they have a very, very large army when they bring in all their reservists. I was told at one briefing in a Scandinavian country that they could actually get up to 300,000 men and women into the field, which is staggering. Sweden too. So if Putin does try to go further north, I think he's going to get a very, very bloody nose.
You mentioned Lenin before and how Putin is angry at Lenin for allowing the creation of the Ukrainian or Ukraine SSR. Let's talk a little bit about that. What happened there that actually has Putin so angry?
Well, Putin was angry simply because he felt that there should have been no acknowledgement at that stage that Ukraine was a separate nation. He has this obsessive ethno-nationalist idea that Ukraine is an integral part of Russia. The Ukrainian language is no more than a dialect. And he tries to dismiss every single element in the Ukrainian patriotism. But what was important, I think, to understand was that there was quite a genuine Ukrainian culture, particularly in the countryside, not so much in the towns. There, it was much more artificial. When you have the leaders of the Ukrainian Rada, like Hrushevsky, who were rather trying to exaggerate the ancient aspects of Ukraine and all the rest of it with the Zaporozhny Cossacks and so forth, that was a little bit, well, in fact, it caused quite a lot of amusement, certainly amongst the Russians living in Kiev in 1917 and 1918. But then it also was used by Putin, I think, to try to emphasize that it wasn't a real country, is his phrase. Yeah. But actually, that's unfair and totally wrong. I mean, obviously, Ukraine is a borderland, there's no doubt about it, both in name and in reality. And it does have, and has always had, close links to Russia, but not necessarily through its own volition.
Do older Ukrainians, especially Ukrainians in general, still harbor resentment about the way their country or their Soviet Socialistic Republic was treated by Stalin, especially during the famine?
Of course they do. I mean, the whole thing of the Holodomor of 4.5 million, roughly 4.5 million dead, and that was a man-made famine of the worst order. Stalin, first of all, wanted to break the back of the kulaks. I mean, that was his obsession of killing what he thought were the rich peasants. But in fact, when he started sending his sort of killing squads out into the countryside, they were often killing middling and even sometimes poor peasants who didn't agree with their policy, which was basically seizing all the food. And this is where the famine came from. They didn't just seize any of the surplus food, i.e. food that they were going to eat to survive on in the winter, but they were also seizing all of the seed corn for the next year. And so you have a very, very rapid acceleration into famine. And Stalin was totally pitiless.
My question may have seemed like an obvious one because history always matters, but I am curious as to what extent do these many different layers of history play into what's happening now? A war in 2022, I am sure older Ukrainians remember how they were treated by the mother country. I guess that's what I was getting at there.
But there was also an element which we must remember, hatred for the Central Soviet government by Ukrainians often went to an extreme degree, partly because the communists at the time passed rumors saying that actually it was the Jews who'd caused the famine, which was totally untrue. But that, amongst a very undereducated population, did take hold. And that was why so many Ukrainians did work with the SS or acted as militia at the time with the German invaders because of their desperation to get rid of the Soviet state.
You must be reading my mind because my next question was going to be about the Eastern Front in World War II. We have to remember that Ukrainians did, in fact, sign up to fight with, well, they had their own Ukrainian units to fight alongside the Wehrmacht in the invasion of the Soviet Union after June 22nd, 1941.
But what was more striking was that it was Count von Stauffenberg, Colonel Count von Stauffenberg, who was the one who set off the bomb in the Wolf's Lair on the 20th of July, 1944, who was with the Abwehr. And he, in 1941, had argued strongly for setting up a full Ukrainian army of 1 million men, simply because he knew that the Wehrmacht did not have the troops necessary to occupy the whole of the landmass and to control their rear areas. This was completely rejected by Hitler. The idea of putting Slav Untermenschen into Wehrmacht uniforms appalled him. But curiously, even Himmler who was a slavish admirer of Hitler, quietly broke these instructions by setting up Ukrainian SS divisions, calling them Galician. They also set up so-called Cossack squads and a whole Cossack division, cavalry division. And these were used basically to try to pretend that they weren't really Slavs. Well, it was ridiculous. Of course, they were Slavs, but it was to get round Hitler's obsessive view of putting non-Germans, non-Aryans into Wehrmacht uniform.
Well, if Vladimir Putin fancies himself a student of history, he should know that war is folly, and he doesn't have to go back to the 20th century. He can look at recent history, the U.S. in Afghanistan, the USSR in Afghanistan. Sir Antony, of the many lessons I have learned from reading your books is that war doesn't work. Or maybe the better way of putting it is wars almost always last longer, kill more people, cost more money than their instigators believe. And here we are talking about another major land war in Eastern Europe in the 21st century. Do you also see that transpiring here, that this war is going to last much longer and kill many more people than Vladimir Putin anticipated?
It's already killed many more people than Vladimir Putin anticipated. He thought he was going to have a walkover, and he's not getting that. And that's why he's so enraged at the moment. And this, in a way, is one of the alarming aspects, is that the bravery of the Ukrainian resistance is creating the potential for a far more savage and brutal conflict. That is absolutely certain, I think, unless, of course, they do come to some sort of arrangement, which I very much doubt in these negotiations, in these talks.
I'm concerned about the war expanding to other countries.
The old British Army phrase always was, the plan never survives contact with the enemy. And this, I think, is absolutely what we have seen in Ukraine. And what seems so astonishing is how little they thought it through. Here they try amphibious actions in the Sea of Azov, which has an average depth of only 8 meters. So they can't get in any supporting naval warships, and many of their larger landing ships simply can't negotiate the shallows. Like in Prague in August 1968, their logistics are pathetic. As in Prague, you have Russian soldiers now begging food from Ukrainians. Their attacks using tanks and armored vehicles, thinking that this would be the rapid way, a show of armor, and then, of course, the resistance would collapse. That was the idea. But in fact, they're being picked off every single time because they do not have supporting infantry with them. So from that point of view, both the tactics and the strategy have really not been thought through at all. And this is why we are seeing, and may well see, Putin completely losing it, even more than he has already, in his anger.
All of the problems you just described could have been foreseen, right? Or should have been foreseen.
But if the man at the top is going to impose his will in the way that he does, you don't have a chance of making him change his mind. Another parallel in a way here was Hitler's Ardennes offensive in December 1944. All of his generals begged him not to attack in that way, that the whole of this plan to suddenly cut through the Ardennes and go right up to Antwerp and cut off the British and the Canadians in the north, thinking that would knock them out of the war, was absolute folly of the first order. But they couldn't do anything about it. And I'm afraid that's the sort of situation that we're seeing Putin developing at the moment.
My final question to you, Antony Beevor. Did you expect you'd ever be talking about or writing about another conventional war, a conventional land war in Europe? Can you really believe we're talking about this again?
Well, I can now. I have to admit, as I said, that until certain elements fell into place, like the field hospitals, I didn't believe it until then. I thought that he really was simply just tweaking the West tail and scaring the Ukrainians into a form of fainéant or self-subjecting agreement with Russia.
Well, as we know, wars don't end, they migrate to our minds. And we don't know yet what kind of ripple effects this war is going to have. But there will be ripple effects and possibly a legacy of rancor and ethnic hatreds.
Ethnic hatred is going to be slightly difficult here if you're arguing that the Ukrainians, that they are not a separate ethnic base, that he is saying, but we are all brothers, we cannot possibly allow them to break away. That is one area where I think he's going to have trouble. We are starting to get indications of Russian attacks on Jews and on Jewish communities, of which there is a very large community in Ukraine. But, there's always been a terrible, terrible anti-Semitic tradition of pogroms and all the rest of it in Russia, going back a long way. In the Russian Civil War, the pogroms by the right and by the whites, and pogrom by the left, by the Reds, as well as many different groups in between. There's always that danger, but I pray to God it doesn't come about.
We may all agree on that. Antony Beevor, we thank you for returning to the podcast. And again, his next book is coming out in May. The title, Russia, Revolution and Civil War, 1917 to 1921. On the next episode of History as It Happens, as Russia challenges the limits of the post-Cold War order in Europe, China appears ready to eclipse the United States economically and militarily in the coming decades. Will it be the Chinese century? Or will climate change upend the next world order before it begins? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.